We're going to pick back up in Daniel this week. And this week we're going to be in chapter 11, verses 2 through 20. And I am just going to let you know it's kind of technical today. I was telling somebody before the service, I love this, and this is really fun to study. But also, I'm looking forward to Sermon on the Mount, too, because it's just a different kind of literature. There's just a lot of historical stuff to look at today because we're going to talk about prophecy. And we're going to look at the prophecy in Daniel, and we're going to talk a little bit about second coming. So those of you that get nervous about eschatology, don't get too nervous. I'm not going to lay down any hard and fast eschatological rules for you. I'm just going to try to do my best to show you what I think is here in Daniel. But this part of Daniel that we're seeing is prophecy again. And here's what I want you to know from me in the pulpit or the lectern or whatever this is. What we believe here as a church is that we believe that this is actually predictive prophecy. So there's different views on how to interpret the Bible. And we'll actually go over that, a shameless plug, in the class we're going to have in October about how to interpret the Bible. But this literature that we're reading right now in this part of Daniel is prophecy. So what we think that prophecy is, especially this part of Daniel, is predictive of the future, now past for us. But what we don't think is that this is just a metaphor, right? Some scholars take that view that this is just all kind of a metaphor. And so what we also don't think, though, is that every word of the Bible is literal, because that's just not faithful to how literature works in any genre. It'd be like if you read Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis and took every word as literal. Well, there's really not a lion that speaks named Aslan. We know that's a word picture for something else. And so different literature takes different kinds of interpretation. And so we don't think that this prophecy is just a metaphor. We think these are real prophecies of what would happen in the future of God's world. And so then the question is kind of begs the question, if these verses in Daniel have already been fulfilled, why should we take the time to study them? What good will it do for us? And there's a few reasons. First is that God put these in his word to us, so we want to know what God has to say. But another benefit is that it helps us to trust in the sovereignty of God, right? We can see and be convinced that he works out everything according to his will, as Ephesians 1 teaches us. But there's another really important reason and benefit that's kind of overlooked sometimes. As we compare kind of the words and the wording of these prophecies in Daniel to the records we have of ancient history of the people that are talked about in here, we can learn some important rules for understanding prophecy. And I know in our modern day and age, it's all you kind of know about prophecy is the extremes, right? People who call themselves prophet nowadays, I don't know if you see that online, but I've said this before. If you have apostle or prophet in the title of your social media handle, I'm out. I'm not doing it, right? So, but there have been historically some scholars who, to me, are kind of arbitrary on how they decide the principles that they use to interpret prophetic writings. For example, there is a group of ancient scholars known as the Alexandrian Fathers who kind of take a more allegorical approach to Scripture. And so this method kind of spiritualizes the whole Bible. And there's some really funny things that they spiritualize in Song of Solomon that we're not going to talk about today. But everything in the Bible stands for something else in this kind of school of thinking. For example, the children of Israel crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land is really just a picture of Christians passing through death into heaven. Now, that may be a cool secondary kind of interpretation that you can see from there, a word picture. But that doesn't mean that it didn't really happen. That really happened in history. Now, St. Augustine, ancient church father, maybe you say it's St. Augustine, either way is fine. He did a similar thing with biblical prophecy, particularly when it came to the prophecies of the second coming of Christ. So he borrowed from the Alexandrian Fathers. He used this kind of allegorical approach to interpretation. And this really shaped the thinking of much of the Western church for the next 1,500 years or so that when the 16th and 17th century church fathers that we think of as the reformers came along, they leaned heavily on the writings of Augustine. So if you ever read John Calvin or Martin Luther, those guys loved Augustine. They basically adopted his view of the second coming with it seems like not very many questions. But rather than being arbitrary as to how we interpret prophecy, it's really kind of important to see how the prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled in history, and then use the same principles that we see there as we think about prophecies having to do with the second coming of Jesus, right? And so if you're wondering, like, we're an Alliance church, we think the coming of Jesus is imminent, and we want it. That's kind of our basic idea about that. Now, as far as pre-mill, post-mill, a-mill, all that stuff, let's have a conversation about that over coffee because I find it fascinating. But I find that it can be a little bit something that can trip us up in this setting. That's what we're going to look at today. So biblical prophecy, many times when you hear biblical prophecy, what we're talking about is history written in advance. That's kind of what we're talking about. It's true that the prophetic descriptions of history are mysterious to us, right? Like, I don't know if you've been following along in Daniel, but it's crazy stuff in there. They were to Daniel as well. I mean, you if you've been in this series, have remembered at least a couple times where Daniel was like, I was perplexed. I didn't know what to think. It scared me, right? So all of that stuff is pretty normal. So knowing this principle, that at least some prophecy in history, that at least some prophecy is history written in advance, is going to help to keep you from what really is unhelpful speculation about prophecies or end times, or what we call eschatology. There are Christians who get really caught up in this and kind of lose touch with the reality because they're all just like worried about the end times, right? And so we may not always be able to understand the prophecy until it is history, but if you understand this principle, what it kind of forces you to do is to know the prophecies so that you're prepared to know them when you see them, right? And so that's what's kind of important. The second kind of principle or thing you want to keep in mind when it comes to prophetic interpretation that comes from the study of these verses is that prophecy is written for future generations. Almost always in the Bible, prophecy is written to tell people in the future about what God has done. Here's what the Apostle Peter said about prophecy. 1 Peter 1 said, concerning this salvation, the prophets who spoke of the grace that was to come to you searched intently and with the greatest care, trying to find out the times and circumstances to which the Holy Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. Right? So picture the prophets of old. They're writing these things down that God is telling them about the coming Messiah, and I'm sure they're asking questions. They got to be, right? What does it mean that a child will be born and that he'll be called Emmanuel? What does it mean that a virgin is going to give birth to a son? What does it mean that the Messiah will be cut off? They were probably like us trying to figure out what this stuff meant. And Peter ends in that section from 1 Peter by saying, it was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you, that's collective church you, when they spoke of these things. So the prophets were serving the future church when they spoke their prophecies. The same is true of the second coming of Jesus, or the second advent. Some of the prophecies of Christ's return were given to Daniel and to the Old Testament prophets, while some are given to John and the New Testament apostles, but they are all revealed for you, or at least for those who will be alive when Jesus comes back, right? So with that kind of basic overview in place, we're going to dig into some of the historical stuff here in Daniel chapter 11. So the purpose of Daniel 11 is really to prepare God's people for two great crises that are going to come. The first is the persecution of God's people by a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. And the first crisis comes in about the year 170 BC, which is recorded for us in Daniel 11, 21 to 35, which we're going to study that next week. But the second great crisis is the persecution of God's people by the Antichrist, Epiphany. And this second crisis occurs just prior to the return of Christ. And again, we'll look at this a little bit next week in Daniel 11, 36 to 12, 3. But here's what you need to know. Chapters 10 through 12 of Daniel are kind of one continuous chunk of thought. Even though the chapter divisions in our Bible don't really do a great job of indicating that. So if you didn't know this, the chapter and verse numbers not inspired in your Bible. Like, they're not from God. They're just there as tools for us to be able to say, go to Daniel chapter 11, right? So it's easy to get to, kind of like page numbers in a book. But there's a heading in most Bibles at the beginning of chapter 11 that says the kings of the south and the north. Maybe that's in your Bibles. This section is really a prediction of the events of the kings of the north, that's the Syrian kings, and the kings of the south, that's the Egyptian kings. And so the first three verses really set the stage for the kings of the north and the kings of the south with an overview of the kings of Persia and the first king of Greece. And this is written in advance and kind of covers the years of 530 to 150 BC. And so the next division then occurs between verses 35 and 36. The NIV actually has a section heading there that says the king who exalts himself. And this section kind of covers 1136 to 12:4. It's really, again, just one unit, although some translations like the NIV throw in a subtitle. It's kind of unnecessary. And you'll see that if you have that translation. But the king who exalts himself is this person called the Antichrist, who is going to rule just prior to the return of Christ, okay? Now, in Daniel 11, 2 through 20, the prophet is going to give an overview of history that's going to lead up to the first crisis. Verse 2 is going to speak of three kings of Persia and then a fourth. And the point of this verse is not to say that there are only four kings in the history of Persia. That's not what it's getting at. That's why the text says that there will be three more kings. The main point of the verse is to show something very important about the fourth king. It's to emphasize the fourth king. So the three kings of Persia mentioned here are Cambyses, Pseudo-Smyrtus, and Darius. And so Darius the first was the father of Xerxes or Ahasuerus, depending on what you've read, who became the husband, you might know this name, of Queen Esther. Okay, Xerxes is the fourth king of verse 2, which says, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. So the book of Esther, if you know this story, opens with Xerxes hosting basically a 6-month-long party, a fair, to display his wealth and his military power. And it's in the 3rd year of his reign. It says, for a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. And so you might remember that he asks his wife, Vashti, to come in and basically put on a show. And that means what you think it means for his friends, because they were basically a bunch of drunk men and they wanted a show, and she refused, rightly. And so he then basically creates an edict that kicks her out of his presence forever. And this is then followed by a week-long banquet in the citadel of Susa. He's demonstrating his military power, and he's doing this because he's about to march his huge army to the west and try to shore up his kingdom. And so then Xerxes is drawn into a battle with the Greeks. He crosses the Aegean Sea. He sails towards Greece. He loses that battle, and this is the beginning of the end of the power of Persia. Just as Daniel had prophesied in chapters 2, 7, and 8, Babylon will be followed by Persia, and Persia will be followed by Greece as a world power. King Xerxes comes home to Persia. He's defeated as a military leader, as a king, and just as a man in general. And so he kind of comes to his senses and wishes for his wife, his rightful wife, but he has made an irrevocable decree, stupidly, that he would not be allowed to, that would not allow her to see him. So he can't see her and, talk it out, because that's what you do when you're defeated as a man. You want to talk to your wife. And so he orders then, and this is, again, another foolish thing he does, he orders a search be made of his entire kingdom to find him a new queen. Because what's good after one unwise decision? Make another one, right? And so after a year, this Jewish girl named Hadassah was chosen, and her name was then changed to Esther. And that's how we get to Queen Esther in the palace. Esther may have had a strong influence on the son of Xerxes, who becomes the next king of Persia. That king's name is Artaxerxes, who employs a cupbearer by the name of Nehemiah that you might recognize. And so Persia dominates the world for the next 150 years until the time of Alexander the Great, which is then accurate, which is what's accurately predicted here in Daniel chapter 11. Look at verse 3. That a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. So the reign of Alexander the Great is also prophesied in Daniel 8. Alexander appears on the scene after his father, Philip of Macedonia, dies in about 336 BC. He conquers many of the kingdoms in the known world, including Persia, by 330 BC. And the last kingdom to be conquered was Babylon, which is now weakened under this Persian rule. And so Alexander the Great wants to rebuild Babylon, not knowing that there's a prophecy that says no one's going to do it. And so he dies in 323 BC. And when he died, the kingdom is divided up among four generals. That's the meaning of that line we just read, broken up and parceled out toward the four winds of heaven, and that it will not go to his descendants. So Daniel prophesies that the kingdom of Alexander is not going to go to his biological descendants. It's going to get broken up into four pieces. So two of the nations are super weak, while two become world powers. The two world powers end up fighting each other over the next 150 years. It's just kind of war after war. Their battles and their struggles for power are predicted in the verses in Daniel that follow. One of those rulers is called the King of the North, a phrase you'll see over and over again in these verses. The kingdom of the north is the kingdom of Syria, which extends from Damascus to Jerusalem, northward into Asia Minor, and west into Macedonia. Macedonia is one of the four ruling kingdoms, but it's also very weak at this time. And Syria also extended into Iraq and Iran. And that's the territory of the kingdom of the north to keep in mind as the prophecy sort of unfolds. The other kingdom is called the kingdom of the south. Look at verse 5 of Daniel 11. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. So this king is Ptolemy Lagos. 100% sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but hey, here we are. He gained control of the land of Egypt through very shrewd military tactics. Actually pretty interesting the way that it worked, but I didn't have space in here. And so he won the trust of the Egyptian people by kind of, how would you say, being a politician. He followed Alexander's lead in declaring himself a successor to the ancient pharaohs, and he worshiped at the shrines of the Egyptian gods, right? And so the kingdom of Egypt then is ruled by the Ptolemies for almost 300 years. So in terms of worldly geopolitical power, this guy's pretty shrewd and smart. Their kingdom extended west into northern Africa and all the way into what is now Lake Victoria. So what does the prophecy mean in verse 5? The king of the north shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall have a great authority. Well, one of Ptolemy's generals in 316 was a man named Seleucus. He becomes even stronger than Ptolemy and returns to Babylon to establish his own kingdom, which becomes the kingdom of the north, or Syria. Daniel chapter 11, verses 6 to 20, is really concerned with the history of these two powerful kingdoms. The purpose of these verses is really, again, to give an overview of history in advance so that the people of God, who God is assuming would know this scripture, will be prepared for the coming of the first major crisis recorded in Daniel 11, 21 to 35. And so this passage is kind of divided into three sections. You've got the events surrounding Laodice and Bernice, which is verses 6 to 9, the career of Antiochus III, verses 10 to 19, and then the reign of Seleucus in verse 20. So let's look at Daniel 11, verse 6. So that was all intro. Just kidding. Daniel 11, verse 6. After some years, they shall make an alliance. And the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. Okay, so there's been years of hostility between these two kingdoms. And after these years of hostility, they desire peace. They want to promote a lasting peace. They want to become allies. So Antiochus II The grandson of Seleucus I is ruling Syria, the kingdom of the north. Ptolemy II is ruling in Egypt, the kingdom of the south. And so to seal their alliance, they do what ancient kingdoms have always done. Ptolemy gives his daughter Bernice in marriage to Antiochus II. The marriage is accompanied with a huge celebration as she comes to the Seleucid capital of Antioch. Antiochus put his first wife Laodice away and sent her and her sons to Ephesus in Asia Minor. So it's crazy, right? He's married, but he says, you know what? Just forget that, and let me get this new wife and make a political alliance. It is a rough world. And so they're put away, his first wife and children. But Bernice doesn't retain her power as queen because Antiochus II, in case you think life is great for her, grows tired of her after she has a son. And he goes to Ephesus to live with Laodice, but he is poisoned by her. I mean, I get it. To ensure her children's right to the throne of Syria. This is literal cloak and dagger stuff, right? Daniel 11, 6-7. I know all the ladies are like, yeah, Laodice, good job. Daniel 11, 6-7. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. Verse 7. And from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place. So, Bernice is handed over to Laodice. The second queen is handed over to the first queen after the first queen poisons the king, and she had Bernice and her infant son murdered. Yeah. She had most of Bernice's leading supporters and closest friends killed as well. And at the same time, the father of Bernice, who's Ptolemy II, dies. So one from her own family arose to take his place. This is Ptolemy III, the brother of Bernice. And greatly angered by the murder of his sister, he attacks the Seleucid realm by land and by sea. Verse 7, he shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Okay, Seleucus II now, son of Laodice, is now in power at this time. He fled back to Asia Minor, while the army of Ptolemy III plunders his kingdom and carries the spoils back to Egypt. And the last sentence of that text I just read describes really an unsuccessful counterattack by Seleucus II. So let's keep going. Verse 10. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall raise again a multitude greater than the first. And after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Among your own people is written to Daniel, right? So that's referring to Jews. The sons of the king of the north, Seleucus II, who again had an unsuccessful attack on Egypt, prepare for war. They assemble a great army. And Seleucus II now has two sons. The older, who's Seleucus III, begins to assemble forces to attack Egypt, but he is killed in a revolt 4 years after becoming the king. So he's succeeded by his younger brother, Antiochus III, who swept on, quote, like an irresistible flood and carried the battle as far as his fortress. That's verse 10 of chapter 11. He completely defeats the king of the south, which is Ptolemy III. And Antiochus reestablishes control over most of the land they had formerly held and keeps Egypt at bay for almost 36 years of constant fighting. Now, the last sentence of that section that I referred to, again, it talks about a revolt by a small group of Jewish men in the land of Israel. They give their support to Antiochus in hopes of gaining freedom from Egypt. Their vision of better conditions for Israel under Antiochus fails. because it's ultimately his son who brought horrible pain and destruction on God's people. So all that stuff that Daniel predicted has now happened. Egyptian forces at that time then tried to retain control of Israel, and this results in one of the great battles in the career of Antiochus III at Gaza, and yet it's the same Gaza that we hear about today, the same part of land, or same piece of land. And in 198 BC, Antiochus gained control of Israel, which the Ptolemy dynasty had controlled for more than a century. In Daniel 11, 15, and 16 says this, that the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. So despite 36 years and just countless military victories, Antiochus III finally falls. He's not able to completely conquer Egypt, and so he then decides on diplomacy. 11:17 of Daniel says this, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. So what he does, and what is prophesied in these verses, is that Antiochus the Great decides to give his daughter in marriage again to the king of Egypt, hoping that she'll influence her husband to support him. Now, this is dysfunctional family stuff, like crazy, right? And so he wants her, as he gives her away to be married to a man she doesn't know, to then support him and convince her new husband to support him. So the king of Egypt is Ptolemy V. The daughter of Antioch, the daughter that Antiochus gave was named Cleopatra, might know that name, who became the first influential Egyptian woman to bear that famous name. So she gives her loyalty to her husband instead of standing with her father. Discouraged with this attempt in Egypt and really not satisfied with the amount of land he already controlled, Antiochus turns his attention to the coastland, which is a word in Scripture used to kind of designate all of the land across the Mediterranean Sea to the west of Israel. So this is recorded for us in verse 18. Look at verse 18. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. So as he attacks the coastlands, he is turned back by the forces of a rising new superpower on the geopolitical world scene. Not many people had heard of this kingdom at this time, but this is a little kingdom you might know called Rome. The fourth kingdom of Daniel chapter 2. And so the Roman armies defeat Antiochus the Great. And so the Roman commander demands that Antiochus surrenders his navy, give up most of his land in Asia Minor, pay a huge, what's called an indemnity or like a penalty, and give Rome tribute, like a tax, for the next 12 years. And the Roman commander also chose 20 men as hostages. One of those hostages was Antiochus' younger son, Antiochus the fourth, later known as Antiochus Epiphanes. That's going to be important in a week or so when we look at Daniel. With his kingdom reduced and basically his treasury pretty much gone, Antiochus the Great makes his eldest son Seleucus IV co-regent. That means like co-king. And he goes to the eastern part of his kingdom in search of essentially gold and funds. And Daniel 11:19 says that he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So when Antiochus III tried to rob the treasury of a small temple in the east, the guardians of the temple actually attack him, kill him, and he's never seen again. And so the reign of Seleucus IV, the successor of Antiochus III, is referred to in verse 20, which says this, then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken neither in anger nor in battle. So in comparison to the 36 years of his father's reign, the 11 years of his own reign seem like just a few years, right? That's not very much. He sent out a tax collector, basically to try to replenish the money his father had lost, but it didn't work. And so his chief minister conspires against him and kills him. He is destroyed, and just as Daniel said, not in anger or in battles. He's destroyed basically, again, like in cloak and dagger type of stuff. So after all those facts from history, why does this matter to us? I know some of us read a book like Daniel like, okay, but what does this have to do with me, right? What's the significance? Well, here's a couple things to think about. First, this fulfilled prophecy, when we look at the historical records and see how this stuff was fulfilled, it just is another confirmation for us of God's sovereignty in the affairs of the world, of mankind and of the nations. No one comes to power except the people that God places in that position of authority, right? That's tricky for us. Particularly in our culture, the way that our political system works. That's tricky for us. But Paul says in Romans 13, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. Now remember who he's saying this to. He's saying this to Christians in the Roman Empire who don't have a vote, right? He says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Daniel 11, 2 through 20 shows us that this is true. So, what does that mean? It means we honor and we submit to authorities, part of which means, and I want you to hear this part, that we in honorable ways dissent from those in authority when they are wrong. It doesn't mean we just do whatever they say, even if it's wrong. And I'm going to point you back to the example of Queen Vashti that we talked about earlier today, right? In that situation, her husband is in authority over her. He's the king. He says, hey, come do this wrong, inappropriate, evil thing. And she says no. And the Bible talks about her as a good example. So part of submitting and honoring the authorities that God has placed over us means that we, in honorable ways, dissent from that authority when they do wrong. So God is in control, right? So that's another thing we need to be reminded of again and again and again in Daniel. God is in control. So what does that mean for us? We fear not. Don't be afraid. Listen to the words of the prophet Isaiah. Remember them next time you get worried about our government or a leader or some world event, which is going to be in an hour and a half when you're at lunch. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground than he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. Right? So whatever happens, just know it's nothing to God. So fear not. Secondly, this fulfilled prophecy gives us some instruction in understanding similar New Testament prophecies that regard the second coming of Jesus, right? So we view the Old Testament through the lens of the New, but the Old Testament can give us keys to help us with the New Testament. So to end, I just want to give you an example from Luke 21. If you want to flip there, you can. Luke 21, 20 to 28. I'm going to read it and then just have a few ideas on it. Is what Jesus says. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be for in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Now imagine knowing Daniel chapter 11 and living in the days when Antiochus II divorced Laodice and married Bernice, right? The events of the day make what's happening unmistakable, since God has told you in advance, right? And so in those days, some of the prophecies of Daniel 11 had been fulfilled, but some were yet in the future. And so you study the prophecies because they're warning you of a great crisis that's coming in Daniel, but you don't know when. That's how it is with Luke 21. Some of the prophecy has been fulfilled. And Luke 21, 20 to 24 was fulfilled at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, we have no idea how much time is going to pass between verses 24 and 25 of Luke 21, but the next main event on the sort of prophetic clock of Luke 21 is described here in these words in verses 25 and 26. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Now, at the same time, I want you to hear both sides of this. At the same time, as it's important to understand this, the Apostle Paul would later say, hey, don't get too caught up in looking at the sun and the moon and all that stuff and forget to train yourself in righteousness. So there's discernment on these. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Like the people living during the fulfillment of the prophecies of Daniel 11, we're not able to imagine exactly what all these things mean as we look into the future, right? We have no idea about the future. We have no idea what's going to happen in 10 seconds. I assume it's going to still be me making this rant and wasting time that I don't have. And here we are. But when these things begin to happen, they're going to be just as clear to us as the events of the 4th through the 2nd centuries BC were to those who might have known the prophecies of Daniel chapter 11, right? They observed those prophecies. They prepared themselves for the coming of a crisis. Now, as we think about the end times and the Bible predicting what is very difficult stuff at the end of all things, it's easy to be afraid. That is a normal human sort of response. But I just want to end with the words of Jesus in verse 28 of Luke 21 that we read, because it's so important for us in terms of how we actually live now. Listen to the perspective Jesus gives in verse 28. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Notice what he doesn't say. When you see these things, cower in fear. When you see these things, try to take political power and stop it from happening. When you see, no, he doesn't say any of that. What does he say? Lift up your heads, stand up, because your redemption is drawing near. If you go back and read Luke 21, which I would commend to you, you will see that these things that Jesus mentions are not fun. It's scary sounding stuff. There's difficult things in there, like there was in Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 11. Chaotic, hard things. But those words that Jesus ends that section with are just so important. Lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near, right? What a promise to hold on to. Lift up your heads, because redemption is coming close. God is almost here. Let me pray. Jesus, we thank you that every moment that we breathe and that we live, our redemption is drawing nearer and nearer. And so would you make us a people who know what your word says, who know what the prophecies say, and yet at the same time would you make us a people who are humble and willing to see that there could be different interpretations and different things, but that we would be prepared for your coming, and that we would not be scared of what's ahead, but wisely look ahead and live now as your people who are already in the kingdom that is coming. We thank you for the reality that we live in the already and the not yet. And would you make us wise people who live in that tension well, and who long to see other people come into this kingdom that exists now and is yet coming. And so I ask that as we continue to worship by taking the meal together, that we would just be, again, edified by it, and you'd be glorified by that, and that we'd go out from here and be, like your word says, salt and light wherever we go. Amen.